The NFC South is one of the most talented divisions in the NFL, with 4 extremely young quarterbacks and extremely young rosters. Today, let's do our AFC South division preview. So as I mentioned, this division is extremely young and extremely entertaining. There are 4 really good rosters with 4 extremely young and bright future quarterbacks. Whether it's CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, Trevor Lawrence, or even Will Levis, this is a ridiculously fun division in general. So in today's video, we're going to break it down quite easily. We're going to start off by talking about each individual team for about 2 to 3 minutes. And then at the very end of the video, I'll give you guys my full-on division preview. Now, real quick, before we actually get into the video, around 92% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel and continue to watch my videos. So if you enjoy the content, if you guys enjoy the videos, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button because that would mean a lot to me. Let's hop into the video. So as I mentioned, we are going to start off by talking about each individual team first, and to start the video, we will discuss the Tennessee Titans. Now, last year, the Tennessee Titans season went about kind of how we expected. They went 6-11 and kind of had a disappointing season, and of course, Will Levis did come in at the back end of last year and actually played pretty decently. And in this offseason, they did a really good job of surrounding Will Levis with as much talent as physically possible, both offensively and defensively. Some of the big name pieces they brought in this offseason were guys like Tony Pollard, Calvin Ridley, Tyler Boyd, JC Latham, Lloyd Cushenberry, Vondre Sweat, Kenneth Murray, Chidobe Awuzie, and of course, L'Jarius Sneed. They also overhauled the coaching staff this offseason, which I wasn't a big fan of, but I definitely did understand it. Me personally, I just kind of view Mike Vrabel as one of those really good, hard-nosed, cultured guys. But I do understand why they wanted to head into a different direction. It does make some sense. I think the key for the Tennessee Titans is going to be the development for Will Levis. Last year, we definitely saw some flashes in the back end of last year. He finished off with 1,808 passing yards, 8 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. And we definitely got to experience the roller coaster that Will Levis does bring. You will see him one game go out there and dice up the team like the Miami Dolphins, and then the next game he'll go out there and just really struggle against some really bad teams. That was sort of the reason why Will Levis didn't go in the first round of last year's draft, was because he was a little bit inconsistent, and that's kind of what we saw in his first year. So if Will Levis can develop some sort of consistency as a starting quarterback in the NFL, we're talking about a guy who's going to be an awesome quarterback. And I definitely do think that the Titans have surrounded him with so much talent that I think he should be able to do it as early as next year. When you're a guy who's not taken in the first round and somebody who was taken in the second round, there's not as much wiggle room for you to be trying to earn that number 1 spot as the quarterback. For example, you look at a guy like Bryce Young, who's going to get 3 to 4 to 5 years to prove that he is genuinely the guy, whereas Will Levis probably won't get that much time. I think at least he'll get maybe 2 years next year and this year. But I honestly do believe that if he has a rough 2024 season, they'll probably just look in the draft to get a new quarterback. With that being said, though, I really do believe in Will Levis. I think he will be the future quarterback for this franchise, and I think he's going to have an awesome season. Weapons-wise, he has a bunch of big-name guys like Tony Pollard, Tyjae Spears, Calvin Ridley, Treylon Burks, DeAndre Hopkins, Tyler Boyd, some fun tight end prospects. I think the offensive line is still a work in progress, but man, that left side of the offensive line with JC Latham, Peter Skoronski, and Lloyd Cushenberry is something to mess with. And then defensively speaking, you have a bunch of big-body defensive linemen with guys like Jeffrey Simmons, Tavondre Sweat. I was a big fan of Sweat coming out of college. I thought he could have been a first-rounder. Then Sebastian Joseph Day, who I'm excited to see in a Tennessee Titans uniform. I also didn't mention, but they also have Keandre Coburn, so they have that Texas duo at that nose tackle position. And then your linebackers are still pretty solid. You have guys like Kenneth Murray, Jack Gibbons, and Arden Key. I'm not the biggest fan of Kenneth Murray. I think he's a little bit overrated, but I also do think that he has a lot of talent and he has the physique and body to be a really good linebacker in this league, so I think it's worth a shot. And I think the secondary took a big step forward this offseason. Bringing in guys like L'Jarius Sneed and Chidobe Awuzie are going to be 2 awesome cornerbacks for this franchise. Your safeties are going to be similar to last year with Amani Hooker and Elijah Molden, not to mention Roger McCreary will be sticking in at that nickelback position. I think the secondary for this team is actually pretty solid all around, and I look at basically every single positional group on this team and don't really have a ton of question marks. I think the biggest question mark does come with Will Levis and where he can take this team. Again, as I said earlier, this team is completely reliant on Will Levis, and because we don't know what version of Will Levis we're going to get, it's really hard to accurately predict how many wins they'll get next year. So that being said, I'm going to predict them to win somewhere between like 6 to 10 games. 6 being as if Will Levis is just an okay quarterback or a below average quarterback, and 10 being that Will Levis actually plays pretty dang well next year. But alright, we talked about the Tennessee Titans. Let's go ahead and move on now now to the Indianapolis Colts. And I'll be completely transparent with you guys, I am a massive fan of the Indianapolis Colts, not as like a fan perspective, but in terms of just enjoying the overall roster. At the end of the day, I am a Raiders fan, so there's not a whole lot to support over there. Last year, the Indianapolis Colts finished third in the division with a 9-8 record, and actually had a really good shot at potentially making the playoffs before they just fell short last year. And in this offseason, they did a really good job of just surrounding the rest of the roster with even more talent. They were not too aggressive in pursuing a bunch of big name prospects, but they did do a very good job of surrounding some of their younger players with another bit of talent. I do personally think that this team still needs a full maybe year or two of development to be an even better team, but I think looking at this roster just on paper, it looks pretty solid. We'll talk about Anthony Richardson a little bit later because I want to talk about him in more detail, but his weapons are going to be guys like Jonathan Taylor, Trey Sermon, Michael Pittman Jr., Josh Downs, Adonai Mitchell, and then in the tight end room, they kind of have four guys who can all play with guys like Jelani Woods, Kylan Granson, Will Mallory, and Mo Alley Cox. It will be very interesting to see how they work out that tight end rotation because none of those guys have really stood out amongst the rest, so maybe one of those guys can stand out this year. And then obviously the offensive line is essentially the same as last year. It's still a very solid unit. Defensively speaking, this team still has a couple of question marks, mainly within the secondary, but I think the rest of the defense is starting to come into form. If you watched any of my mock drafts the entire season, you guys would know that I consistently had the Colts taking a cornerback to add alongside Kenny Moore. But instead, they opted to go with who they thought was the best defensive player in Laiatu Latu. And to be honest with you guys, I cannot disagree. I think on paper, he is a fantastic edge rusher. And as long as he doesn't get injured, we're talking about a guy who could probably average 10 to 15 sacks a season. He sort of reminds me of somewhat of like a Trey Hendrickson type, where he's probably going to get a lot of sacks, but not a lot of recognition, which for a team like the Colts, they could definitely use some of that. But let's go ahead and direct ourselves back to Anthony Richardson. If you guys have been watching my content the entire offseason, I've talked very highly of Anthony Richardson. I truly do believe that he has the potential to be the best quarterback in this division. And yes, this is the same division with CJ Stroud in it. Anthony Richardson, to me, coming out of last year's draft, was the most talented player, but not the best player. I thought he was extremely raw, and I thought if he could go into a situation with a good head coach who knows how to maximize his play style, then we're talking about a guy who can have a 10-15 year plus career for a single franchise. And luckily for Anthony Richardson, he happened to just go to the perfect franchise in the perfect situation. Shane Steichen is a guru of quarterbacks. His offensive system is extremely easy, but while also being complex enough for defenses to struggle to defend it. In case you guys are unaware, Shane Steichen was the offensive coordinator for the Philadelphia Eagles when they made it all the way to their championship run. And obviously, we saw the downfall of that offense from Shane's 2022 season to the 2023 Philadelphia Eagles, where they absolutely sucked offensively for like half the season. And in this past year, the offense for the Indianapolis Colts was actually pretty solid. The defense was honestly pretty solid. They just gave up a lot of really big plays. So as long as the defense can cancel out some of those big plays, they should be good enough for the offense to be able to kind of carry them. Because I think offensively speaking, once you get a fully healthy Anthony Richardson, which is sort of a big caveat right now because we don't know if he's going to be able to stay healthy, but assuming he does stay healthy, I really do think this Colts offense has the chance of being a top 5 offense in the league next year, because they're going to rely on the run game with Jonathan Taylor and this awesome offensive line, and when they need to, they're going to run the ball and pass the ball with Anthony Richardson to his select group of weapons too, where he has guys like Pittman Jr., Josh Downs, Adonai Mitchell, Alec Pierce. So he has a bunch of guys who he can also throw the ball to. So this offense doesn't really have a weak point, maybe outside of like the tight end position, but who really cares about that? So this team is going to probably average 4.5 yards a carry, while Anthony Richardson is also probably going to average like 8 yards a pass, and they're just going to dominate you guys consistently going down the field over and over again. So as long as this defense can be good enough, I think this Colts team is going to be really fun in 2024. As for how many wins they're going to get, again, it completely depends on the health of Anthony Richardson. If Anthony does go down at any single point this season, I think it could definitely doom their season. So with that being said, I'm going to predict them to win somewhere between 8 to 12 wins next year. If Anthony can stay healthy and he actually plays up to the level that I think he can, then I think this team could honestly win around 10 to 12 games. But if Anthony misses some games, or if he doesn't really show off his talent as much as I think he will, I think 8 games is a pretty realistic mark for them. But next up, let's go ahead and talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars, the team that was once the ruler of this division, but is now kind of falling off the reins a little bit. Last year, they went 9-8 and technically finished second or third in the division. Despite not making the playoffs, though, they actually had a positive net point differential, albeit it was only a +6, but they still outscored themselves more than they were willing to give up. And in this offseason, they shored up a couple positions. I wouldn't say it was a massive overhaul this offseason, but I definitely do think they brought in a couple key players. Offensively, they brought in Mac Jones to be the backup to Trevor Lawrence. Kind of a weird and shocking move, but also a move that I do understand. Then they brought in Brian Thomas Jr. to shore up the receiving core, not to mention Gabe Davis. I think that's actually a pretty awesome receiving trio. Then defensively speaking, you brought in guys like Eric Armstead, who was pretty okay last year, but I do think is going to be able to play a bigger role on this defense. And that was basically the jux of most of their moves. They also did pay a couple of their big name guys as well, such as Josh Allen. And I thought their draft was okay. I didn't think it was an impressive draft, especially after Brian Thomas, because I just didn't see anybody really getting significant playing time. But maybe one of those guys could maybe develop into being something in the NFL. For this Jaguars team, in my opinion, to get back to the mountaintop of the AFC South, I think it does completely rely on the development of Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence was obviously horrible in his rookie season, but that was not his fault. He was basically in the Bryce Young situation in 2021. And then in 2022, he had a pretty decent season. He played pretty well. They made the playoffs. They surprised the Chargers. And then obviously it all came falling down in 2023. And now in 2024, this team has the expectations to again try to compete for the AFC South. This is one of the more talented teams within the division, and I do think that it is reasonable to say that this is sort of a make or break year for Doug Peterson and maybe a lot of other players on this roster. Obviously, Trevor just got paid, so it's not really a make or break year for him, but I do think he needs to kind of prove himself to be worthy of that contract. Because I think it's pretty fair to say that thus far through his career, he didn't really earn that contract. And I personally believe that if Trevor does want to earn his contract, and I say earn as if he has to do anything, but I think in some sense he has to earn it to earn the respect of the fan base. But for him to earn his contract, I think he has to take this team to the playoffs, and I think he has to have an impressive 2024 season. Because again, he wasn't that good last year, but I don't think a lot of it was his fault. I think the situation around him didn't really support him that much, but even so, I didn't think Trevor was that impressive. So in this offseason, they fixed up a couple of key issues. I think defensively speaking, they're basically the same as last year, plus a couple pieces, and I do think that guys like Trayvon Walker will continue to develop and so on and so forth. So as long as we depend on the growth of guys like Trevor Lawrence, Trayvon Walker, and some of the young guys they brought in this offseason, I do think this Jaguars team can be pretty decent next year. A lot of Jaguars fans want to win the division, but I just don't think it's that realistic when you have teams like Tennessee, Indianapolis, and Houston who are all competing for the division at this point. But I will say that this team does have very high potential. They could win over double-digit games this year, or they can probably win like 8 or 9 games. So with that being said, I'm going to predict them to win somewhere between 8 to 11 games this year, 8 being that this team doesn't really live up to the expectations, whereas 11 is like they're going to make the playoffs and going to try to make a deep run in the postseason. Again, this team relies on Trevor Lawrence developing and some young pieces, but I do think there's the talent and the foundation there to be pretty good. But last up, let's go ahead and talk about the Houston Texans, the team that came out of nowhere to win the division in 2024 and the team that is currently the favorite to win it yet again in 2024. Last year in 2023, they went 10-7 and had a net point differential of +24, and the headline of the season was of course CJ Stroud. And in this offseason, they really focused on continuing to add more and more talent to this roster. Offensively speaking, they brought in a number of veteran leadership guys with guys like Joe Mixon, Cam Akers, Stephon Diggs. And then defensively speaking, they also brought in some big name guys like Azeez Al-Shaair and Danielle Hunter. These are all guys who are proven commodities in the NFL. They've been Pro Bowl, they're all pro level guys throughout their careers, and they're now looking for a kind of a payday and a new setting to sort of resurrect their career. Azeez Al-Shaair was obviously with the Titans last year, but he's most known for his 49ers stint where he was with DeMeco Ryans, so I think that is a perfect fit for his defense. And then Danielle Hunter should be the replacement to Jonathan Grenard. And I would make the case that Danielle Hunter is a better player than Jonathan Grenard, so I think that this is slightly a upgrade over him, but he is obviously older. You expect some improvements from Will Anderson in year number 2. You expect him to continue to develop into being that full-on top 10 pass rusher. Then you bring in Stephon Diggs to complete your trio of wide receiving core. You have Stephon Diggs, Nico Collins, and Tank Dell, not to mention your tight ends and Dalton Schultz and Brevin Jordan. That might very well just be the best receiving core in the entire league. Then you bring in Joe Mixon as your replacement to Devin Singletary. Not the biggest fan of this move because I think he's quite similar to Dameon Pierce at this point, but I also understand why they did it. This is a team that doesn't really need a pass-catching running back. They really just need a guy who can get them yards and touchdowns and easy carries. So I do understand it. Offensive line-wise, I think the unit is better than what a lot of people make them out to be. Last year, they were dealing with a bunch of injuries, and now you can officially have your tackle duo back of Laramie Tunsil and Titus Howard. Hopefully, the young guys in Juice Scruggs and Kenyon Green can develop into that left guard center combination, but of course, I think the rest of the offensive line is pretty decent. So assuming that this team doesn't take any steps backwards and that they continue to take steps forward, especially CJ Stroud, this is a team that could probably make a very deep run in the playoffs. They have all the talent in the world. They have CJ Stroud. They have a great receiving trio. The defense is solid. You have a good head coach. Basically, everything is looking really bright for this team. So with that being said, I think they're going to be a better team next year than they were last year. They were a 10-win team in a year where they had a bunch of young players and CJ Stroud was in his rookie season. So now that he has a full offseason with the team, I think the team is going to win somewhere between 11 to 13 games next year. And while I don't think they'll win the Super Bowl, I wouldn't be shocked at all if at the end of the season, they're potentially hosting up the Lombardi Trophy. But alright, we talked about each individual team, so now let's go ahead and do my division preview. And my thought process for this division is that every team is kind of in a similar situation. They all have young quarterbacks that need to continue to develop, while also having pretty young rosters that also need to develop. I think the most unique team of this division is the Titans because they're kind of a veteran roster surrounding a younger developmental quarterback. Whereas the rest of the rosters, yes, they have some veteran leadership, but they also are surrounded by a bunch of young talent. But with that being said, because we don't know what these teams will look like outside of like maybe the Jaguars and the Texans, it's really hard to predict how this division will go. So with that being said, I do think that Houston wins the division, but I do think Indianapolis will be hot on their trails if Anthony Richardson stays healthy and is playing up to the level that I think he can. But again, Houston will likely be number one with like 11 to 13 wins next year. Then I think there's Indianapolis right below them. And I think Indianapolis has the potential to win up to 12 games, but they'll likely win in between 8 to 12. Then Jacksonville at number 3, which I think will win probably between 8 to 11. And then of course Tennessee at the bottom, where I think they'll either win 6 or 10. So as you guys can see, there's a lot of variations this division can go. There is a potential world where Tennessee jumps up to number 2 and it seems like Indianapolis falls to number 4. I wouldn't be shocked at that at all. This is arguably one of the best divisions in the NFL, and in my personal opinion, it is the most talented division in the league. But with all that being said, if you guys enjoyed the video, please hit the like and subscribe button. And if you guys disagree or agree with any of the opinions in this video, let me know in the comment section below. But I love you guys. Peace.